here, the chair will surrender the floor to the manager and to our honored guest, the Honorable Ed O'Malley.
I think I'm just going to turn it over to Ed. I mean, this is a discussion the council's had regarding moving forward with a review of your current ethics policy, and probably more importantly, talk bigger picture and whether or not there's a need for some new thoughts on ethics for the elected officials determined by you. So Ed has agreed, luckily, to help facilitate this session, and I know he's visited with all of you in advance, and so I'll turn it over to Ed.
Thank you, Bob, and it's thank you, Mayor. It's not often anymore that I get introduced as the Honorable. You know, it's been a long time since I was a member of the Elected Officials Club, but yeah, I still get a few pieces of mail every once in a while that addresses, you know, the Honorable Ed O'Malley, and my kids look at it and wonder, what is that? And my wife kind of rolls her eyes, but thank you for that. That alone made it worth it to come help out today. So thank you. I'm excited for this conversation, and I appreciate each and every one of you taking time over the last few days to connect with me. This does need to be a conversation, so there's no presentation. All right, so I did watch your Eco Devo retreat, you know, the other day to get a sense of how these retreats roll here in the city of Wichita. I promise I have more exciting things to do sometimes than to watch your retreats, but it was interesting, and it was helpful to get a sense of how you all work in these retreats. But like, unlike that retreat, there's no presentation, there's no body of information. You know that staff a month or two or so ago prepared about a lot of information about ethics policies. And you have that for your review, and there'll be a time, I assume, when talking at that level will be useful. But today, it's high-level conversation. So my job isn't to present. When I walked in, Tyler said, "Are you the presenter?" I said, "No, I'm the facilitator. I'm not presenting today, but I'm happy to facilitate." So I'm armed with a bunch of questions. Yeah, that's what I brought. And it will take you thinking out loud together as a collective with these questions. The objective, which is there on the agenda, is to begin exploring an updated ethics policy for the city of Wichita. And I think there's some key words in there. To begin exploring, those words are important. So you know, the goal today is to figure out big picture perspective, high level ideas, get a sense of what this means to you all, to get a sense of later in the conversation of how to engage the public in this conversation. You know, what are the best ways in which to do that? So it'll be a good conversation. In my experience working with all sorts of groups, whether they're elected or whether they're private sector organizations, is having this big picture conversation should be a good way to get some people on common ground. Okay, so that's what we're about today. So my job is to ask questions, to provoke, to help move us along. Your job is to think out loud. And I'd encourage you to think of your mindset that way, to think out loud, right? The more conversation, the more you are sharing what you're thinking, the more it's going to help you and your colleagues. We're going to go, Bob, about 9 o'clock tonight, 10 o'clock tonight, something like that? Okay, no, we'll be done by 5. We'll take a break or two along the way. A single function break, if you're lucky, maybe a 2-function break, but we'll pace our work in this conversation. I want to remind you of just a couple more things before we get started with the first question. I want to remind you that I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm here as a volunteer. So you have to be nice to me, and I'm honored to volunteer. The mayor and I talked briefly as I walked in, and I said, you know, I don't think I'd volunteer to do this for Omaha or for Denver or Fort Collins or Oklahoma City, but doing it for my home city, I'm honored to do it. But I am a volunteer, so you got to be nice to me, all right? With the agenda, we're gonna start by getting you all to talk about describing ethical behavior. So we're gonna talk about it in the abstract first, okay? We're gonna wanna then kind of dial in just a bit to what are your aspirations for this work, for this effort of crafting a new ethics policy, and what are your concerns about it. Then we want to transition into talking about how do we engage the public? What does that look like? Okay. Today is not a day to get into the nitty-gritty. It's not a day to get into the here's what a policy would be, what it wouldn't be, here's how we would enforce a policy, here's how we wouldn't enforce a policy. There's a time for that, but that's not today. That's down the road. Frankly, my advice would be that's after you've had some public input, right? So we're going to stay big picture, help kind of frame up the work, and then we'll be on our way. And along the way, if you all have questions for one another, I'd encourage you to ask them. If you have thoughts.
I think everybody in the room knows this, but I just want some scope clarity.
Yeah.
We're not looking for ethics policy for the city of Wichita. We're looking at an ethics policy for the elected officials of the city of Wichita, correct? Just making sure anybody watching at home understands exactly what we're discussing.
Got it.
Yeah, that's my understanding of the scope as well.
Yeah, that feels right. That feels right. Yeah, so that objective could have been a little more clear there.
Yeah.
Appreciate that, Jeff. Good point. Okay, any questions or other comments before we go on? Thank you for that. Okay. And I want you to know that I'll be taking a lot of notes. Bob and the staff team will be taking a lot of notes. So this discussion isn't just going off into thin air. There'll be a body of notes that can be put together to help kind of remind you all of what this conversation was about. Okay, so if you see people scribbling things down, that's what we're doing. All right, first question. On the agenda, the frame for this is describing ethical behavior. And so here's the setup, here's the question. If someone, it's a little goofy, I apologize, but if someone were up on Mars looking down on a city, what would they see or hear to suggest the elected officials in that city were ethical? What would they see or hear? So somebody's up above watching down. You have somebody's watching. What would they see or hear that would suggest to them people are operating ethically? I don't think, by the way, there are right or wrong answers, okay? The only wrong answer is no answers, right? So we're exploring, we're not deciding anything, we're getting the conversation going. So, what do you think?
You know, some of the ethics training I went through in college, the big thing was always don't do anything you don't want in the front page of the paper. However, the environment we're in right now, you don't know how that narrative is going to be delivered. So I think that conversation's changed a little bit.
I think they'd see the same behavior whether or not someone was looking or not.
Yeah. So they would literally, if somebody was watching, they would see.
The same behavior if they weren't watching, if you can
Like
conceptualize that.
If there's a crowd around them, they'd see a certain behavior. If there wasn't a crowd around them, it'd be the same behavior. Yeah. Nice. What else comes to mind? And these first questions are the warm-up questions, right? So.
And I'll just kind of dovetail on what the former council or previous council member said. It gets transparency, I think, and it does. Everyone who takes psychology 101 learns about the light experiment, where they try to test light bulbs to see if light bulbs made you work better. They found out people were working better, but it wasn't the light bulbs, it's because they knew they were under a microscope. They knew they were being watched. So I think that having that transparency, being able to make sure that whatever you're doing could be on the front page of the paper, just innately creates better behavior. And I think, given this past week, when we hear from people who want, let's say body cameras on police, it's similar. It's showing that transparency. It's the idea that what we're doing is viewable to the public. I think installs trust, not just for us, but really it's been shown across different fields and even it's in psychological textbooks even.
I think if somebody's on another planet looking down on the city of Wichita or any other city, seeing ethical behavior, they're going to see an elected official that's in the public, talking openly with the people that are their bosses, answering questions, unfiltered, being open and honest, and having dialogue with the community. I think if you start with that basis, I think that you start to build trust with people and they get to know you. And I think if somebody's looking down from up above, God, I think that's what he would expect or they would expect to see.
Yeah. Yeah, keep going. And the more, this is good. This is a good start. And the more descriptive we can be about like what would literally be the actions they would see or the actions they wouldn't see. You know, sometimes you can know more about somebody based on what they don't do than what they do. But this we're beginning. This is good. What else would come to mind? What would you see or not see? What would you hear or not hear to suggest, to give you evidence that that's ethical behavior there?
I think following up on James's is that you would see genuine care for those that they serve, and the behaviors that would be listening, interacting with people in a genuine way.
And I'll be a little annoying on this, I apologize, but like, what does genuine mean? How would you know if something, if you're
Not
watching?
Is
fake.
genuine or not?
Not fake. People smell BS a mile away.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think so I'll describe it like in terms of listening. It would be, you would see people making eye contact, giving positive nonverbal behavior, not being, so those things that indicate that it's not just a fake, I'm just, yeah, you talk, I'm here. It's truly being part of that conversation
No.
or conversations.
No. Thanks.
They're kind of an inviting environment, you know, where you're welcoming,
Yeah.
you're going to be open, you're going to include everybody in the conversation. You're not going to just stick to one side of the room. You're going to make sure everyone is part of the conversation.
No.
You're going to approach people. You're not going to wait for them to come to you.
Yeah, keep going. It's good stuff.
I think one
Becky.
thing too is putting, in this case for ethics, and you asked specifically about the city of Wichita, but putting the city before yourself and really doing what's best for the community. And we're all in, I've thought about this a lot, and you know, I've talked to people in the community before. In other jobs that I've had, you like your job and you really want to keep it, right? When you're an elected, it's a lot different. Nobody else has to run to keep their position.
Yeah.
So it sometimes there might seem to be the pressure of doing what's best for myself so that I can get reelected, but that's not, to me, what anybody really wants or what our community needs. So I believe in servant leadership wholeheartedly and truly just putting the city's needs before your own, even if it's risky.
And just to push a little bit, Becky, so keep going a little bit, and others can chime in too. Trying to play with what does it look like, literally, to put the city before yourself, and just having spent time in elected office. I know a lot of people who have used the language of, oh, that person over there behind the tree, they are putting themselves in front of the city, right, or the state, you know, or whatever they're. But I don't know many people who've ever claimed that that's actually them, right? But a lot of people's behavior has been described by others as that, right? That happens all the time in politics. So I'm trying to help us, let's just play with that a little bit. Like, what does that mean? You know, what does that mean? Like, how would you know if somebody, what would you see or hear that would suggest they weren't putting the city in, you know, first and foremost? And I'm just playing here with questions and ideas and things like that just to get us going.
Well, something that would indicate to me that someone didn't have, that an elected official didn't have the best interest of the city at heart would be someone who wouldn't listen. So if you won't listen to other opinions, because in my mind, that idea of being ethical and doing what's best for the city as a whole would be that you listen, you do your research, and then you make the best decision for the city based on the information that you have. Not based on what I, Cindy Claycomb, want, based on what I've listened and researched and at the time had the information on.
Yeah.
So the opposite of that would be not listening
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
would be you know,
And we've seen that in the legislature, where you've been there, I'm sure, where the people, the difference between politics and policy, right? Where some's good politics, some's good policy, some's both, and the scary people are the ones who don't know the difference. The ones who think that politics is good policy, and I think the ones that, oh, I really hated that vote, that was really bad policy, but you get it, it's an election year.
Yeah.
And that's some of the type of, I think, conversations that I've had with my friends, you know, in the legislature on all sides, really, where, well, you know why we had to do that. And, but that's, yeah, putting, I think, self-interest ahead of actual progression of the greater good.
Yeah.
I think to the vice mayor's, though, if, I think see that through transparent communication. So if you are, from someone looking down, if we are communicating our thoughts, information that we have, all of that, and you see a vote that maybe conflicts with what you've said, and once you kind of made it personal, I tried to think. So the first fireworks vote that we had as a council, I didn't agree with. We should open it up, but I had more citizens say they wanted tougher restrictions. So I voted for tougher restrictions instead of what I thought. But I've been vocal about that too. So people would know, like, I personally felt we should do more. But I voted with all the folks that reached out and said that they wanted restrictions. So I think if, as a council, if we are just always communicating maybe our thoughts and information and all of that, and then people can check that with our votes and our explanations of such.
So let's keep going, and I think that this is good stuff, and right now we're talking a lot about some like personal attributes, which I think is good, right? Communication, listening, you know, engaging, being inclusive, those are all great, and those are personal attributes, and eventually, I don't know how you're gonna legislate those, right? But I think what you're doing is reminding yourselves that some of this stuff perhaps can't be legislated, and some of it can be, right? And there's a lot of this that is about the character of the people in these positions, right? But let's keep going a little bit more now, and maybe just talk about the things that come to your mind that feel less like the character of the people in the. I mean, it all connects to character. I mean, unethical behavior is going to stem from, you know, bad character and things like that. But I'm trying to get a layer kind of deeper that is less just about they would listen or they would include, and more along the lines of, you know, if their wife's company was bidding for something, it would be disclosed. You know, and I mean, I'm trying to think like more like tactical, like what are some of the types of things that you would see or not see, hear or not hear, that would give evidence that, you know, okay, this is ethical. The question makes sense? Yeah. And you'll find a lot of my questions, those of you who know me well, will know that the questions are half-baked sometimes. Okay, so in the spirit of just generating discussion, if a question comes to me, I'll throw it out there. I'm not discounting the things we talked about first, but they felt like, you know, personal attributes, and I'm trying to now take it to like a different level.
So that exact scenario has happened for me.
Okay.
As a council member, my wife's company has had contracts.
And I didn't know that, by the way, so I didn't use that as an example, Brian.
The company that she works for has
Did your
has
research.
bid and received contracts, and every time that has happened, I have recused myself from the vote
Yeah,
because of the conflict of interest.
yeah, yeah.
So that has happened. It's happened to other council members as well.
Yeah.
So,
My wife's company.
yeah,
and
yours,
it,
Becky.
I didn't know about that one either.
No, you did your research.
So, I mean,
But yeah, it's a little bit uncomfortable, you know, because even in a recusal, people are like, well, what else were you doing behind the scenes, you know, to guide, you know, this just to get to the bench, you know, there's always those things that are going behind, you know, in the back of your mind. But I think you can only do what you can do, and I think it's more than just one recusal. I think it's a pattern of actions, you know. I think it's your pattern of behavior. It's your pattern of ethics, morals, whatever. I mean, if you spend enough time in front of the community, in front of people, they get to know you and know what your morals are, and know what your ethics are, and so still, those are uncomfortable times.
I'm just gonna add, I also think it's not just individualistic, it's also cultural. Throughout my academic studies, we learn about Enron and about just kind of the cultural shift over into being unethical. When my last class from MBA, they talked about, there's a case study about a Japanese company, and the culture was about harmony and saving face, and how confronting misbehavior jeopardized the harmony and so confronting it was actually worse than the person who came in and confronted it wound up leaving, wound up getting pushed out, and then the whistleblower laws and stuff kind of kicked in. But yeah, and trying to explain why that happened, because the culture was about putting out this this image of harmony and trying to, if something ethically wrong happened, trying to not focus so much on that, just try to, and then some other cultures, I guess organizational cultures are, no, if something's wrong, get called out right away, get in front of it, admit it, say you're sorry, move forward. So I think that plays a role as well, because individuals who come in are moralistic, right? Like that's internal, it's not so much a skill set, but that environment you're around, I think kind of adapts to what those expectations are.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought a lot about when I was in elected office was, I don't think many people go into elected office who are bad people. I really, you all know what you go through, right? I mean, to go through all you have to go through to serve, unless your heart's in the right spot, unless you really want to serve your community, why would you do this? Because it's hard work. It's hard work. And so I remember feeling that, I think like 99% of the people up here, and my experience was in Topeka, I think are here for the right reasons. But that doesn't mean sometimes, to get to what you're talking about, Mayor, that the systemic forces don't lead to some things happening that might not be the best for transparency and ethics and things like that. And so in a minute, what I'd love to do is, we're talking about it kind of individualistic right now, and in a minute we'll shift to talk about it more systemic. Okay, I think it's a good approach. So we'll go to systemic in just a minute. What else would you see, like recusing yourself from certain votes where you had a conflict of interest? Feels like an obvious one. What other? Yeah, Becky.
And this is obvious, and Jennifer will be really proud of me, but making sure that we all abide by Kansas Open Meeting Act and are inclusive when we have meetings, Kansas Open Records Act. I mean, Coma and Cory are just, it's kind of a no-brainer. We know we have to do it, but just make sure that we do it.
Yeah.
So.
People would know what those laws say. They would abide by them. They would if they notice, if they're in a conversation all of a sudden that all of a sudden looks like it's not abiding by them, they would say something. Say, hold on a second. Well, I can't do this right now, type of thing. Yeah.
You said the obvious. That's obvious.
No, that's great. That's all right. That's all right. We can.
Well, I think this one's obvious too, but we don't, but it's like taking bribes, that would be unethical.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Bob, that's unethical, right?
Yeah, but I mean, that's an
Jennifer
obvious
has
one, but I
concept.
think we should say it. And then I also think, in some way, being disrespectful of your colleagues, I find that unethical, because I think that is something that the public expects of us. Doesn't mean that you agree with your colleagues, but being disrespectful of your colleagues, to me, is part of, being respectful of your colleagues is part of ethical behavior.
Yeah.
So.
What else? What else? We'll go systemic here in just a minute. Other things?
Also, perspective and image, where we have our packets, anyone can come in and, like last week or a couple weeks ago, anyone can come in and pick up our packet. And someone tweeted at me and says, I can't find a packet info. And then I did some searching, I realized it wasn't available. It was not online. In the legislature, everything's up. You can get amendments get put in, you can follow along, click on things. So I had to upload it to my Docs, my personal G-Doc, make a link, and then tweet it at the person and say, hey, click here, and you now have the whole packet. We'll look to make sure that we have it. And talking to some some people who, there was some information that is public and it's out there, but because it's not so rightfully available, if you have to go through a core request or you have to go, complain before you get it, I think that it almost seems like we're trying to keep it secret, but we're not. And we could get over a big hump just to throw it out there. I think some of it also is image where, how do we make it so we don't look like we're doing something when our intent isn't to do that. And also I think one step beyond that, and then we can get on to the next one, is intent, where I think a lot of us, like you say, come up and are good people, and might do something and the intent matches our ethical core, but the perception of that doesn't. And I think that's where people, well, I didn't mean for it to be that way, I mean it this way, and then that adds to, I think, that perception of the organization as far as where it stands ethically.
Can I ask a quick question, Brendan, just because I want to make sure, since we're live, people understand. So you're saying somebody couldn't find the agenda packet online? Because it's available every Friday by noon, correct, on our city website? And if you go under the department, I think it's departments, and then under city council. So so for people watching today, they know that by Friday at noon, it should always be available to them.
No, I appreciate you bringing that up. I want to be clear with this. It wasn't the agenda packet.
Oh, okay.
It was the packet for, and for the people online, just so we know, it was our retreat, our budget retreat, where we had the information up on the screen, but like help me out, the PowerPoint, right? I hate PowerPoint, by the way, so I'm trying to push that out. We had the information up, but when you zoom in, you try to figure it out, and then one of the things that had up that was public, that wasn't there were the low descriptions. So in the online discussion, it was obvious that people thought this line item meant this, but once you kind of dig into our packet, which had the descriptions, then it cleared up the information. So that was what I had to load and put up, but it wasn't the agenda packet.
Yeah, but you'd see individuals, or you'd see a system like going the extra mile to make that stuff available. And if it wasn't available and somebody needed it, you'd see them going the extra mile to say, "Oh, we'll get it for you. Hold on a second. Sorry, our bad. Here we go. Yep. Let's figure out if we can fix this." Yeah, that makes sense. Other things on your mind about like what individuals would do or not do? What about systems? Let's just talk about that for a minute. Like, what would be the, Bob and I were talking the other day about in the ancient city of Athens, there was an oath, that citizens took. I did some research on it since we talked last, and it was when you became an official citizen, you took this oath, and it was all about how you'd conduct yourself and this kind of the spirit of the way they wanted the group, the system to operate. How would a culture or a system operate if you were looking at a group of elected officials that have to work together? What would you see to suggest that they are operating with high ethical behavior? And I think it might not always be just a sense of kumbaya either. I mean, I think that might be a stating the obvious, but.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think of, and maybe this isn't what you're getting at, but I think that in a system, you would have a set of common definitions of whatever it is. I mean, I can name off a whole, many things that would be in an ethics policy, for example. But if you don't start in your system with a set of common definitions, then Brian might say a word, and I think that means something, and he thinks it means something else. And so anyway, I think you get it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Culturally, I mean, when you think about ancient culture, I'm not going to get down this rabbit hole, but it meant more to have a code of honor, right? Like the Persians, for instance, had an experiment to make a society in which lying was like punishable by death. Like they wanted to actually stomp out lying, but as objective people, like it's very tough to kind of figure out that line is. So an honor code, and then if you kind of get to, I think my personal, and I won't project this on anyone else, my personal core, like we have the Ten Commandments, and they laid it out for you, right? And then all these parables on how to behave ethically. So I think that in our culture, you usually, just like what the vice mayor said, have this kind of, this is the framework, and we expect you to go above and beyond, but a set of core tenets, I guess, that we're all gonna live by this. And you risk interpretation of that, of course, but at least it's out there. And then I think you get to what, law might talk about as a reasonable interpretation, where does this mean that? And then that's usually, I think, what a lot of this discussion leads to. Okay, well, can we all agree on these core tenets, right? And then it gets into the weeds a little bit about, we're not going to accept gifts, but what if someone comes to the front and gives us a T-shirt, it's worth $5, would it be more offensive to hand that back and say, don't try to buy my vote? Or to accept a T-shirt, from a nonprofit. So then it gets into, I think, the weeds a little bit, but it all starts out usually as this is the outline.
Yeah, so what you'd see, like a culture of a group, you'd see some common language, some common definitions, you'd see some common tenets, that if you asked one person, hey, what are the common tenets that you all kind of abide by to make sure that ethical behavior is flourishing in City Hall? If I asked the mayor, or if I asked the vice mayor, or if I asked, a council member from the first district, I get the same answers, right? Okay. Other things that come to your mind about what you would?
I would say, I'm taking this from Brian because he said it before, but just common facts. So, you have what maybe the council decided or the true information as well as your opinion. And so I could hear the true information from every council member and the mayor, but then also hear their opinion of it rather than just like one piece of it that doesn't really show the whole truth.
And just the reason why, again, we're not going to craft the policy today, but how this conversation connects, is I could imagine, Bob, something for the staff to maybe think about is eventually a policy that makes clear the definition of key terms. Eventually the staff making sure that these key tenets are known, that there's not too many of them, it's simple enough, right? Things like, it's hard to, in the policy, name the common facts, but maybe have a process for when there's conflict over the facts. And sometimes there's conflict over opinions, but that's okay. But if there's conflict over important facts, that might contribute to whether somebody's being ethical or unethical. A way to resolve that might be a piece of this. So,
a way to resolve that I think is important where, and I'm going to be brief for this, but there's like a parable of a saint someone who was sanctified later, and he's rowing down past a group of people trying to kill him on a river, and the boat's doing this, and they say, hey, have you seen so-and-so? And he responded, I hear he's nearby, and goes past him, which he was technically nearby, but also being dishonest because he didn't just say it was him. So, did he lie? Is that a sin? And we can argue that, but I think it's more important when those type of situations come up is if we can't agree on those type of situations as a body, can we agree on a process to finding the truth? Can we agree on, okay, well, this is going to be a process where if we're at disagreement, we're going to go to this person who's a neutral third party and their group to help us decide. And in our culture, we have the courts for that, where we go, our society, we set up, we disagree, we go to court, and a judge will hear you. When it comes to, I think, this type of policy, what is that? Because most of us, we don't have problems with the easy stuff. We don't steal, right? Like we don't want to behave this way or that way. Like there's the commonalities, but then there's that, I think, almost that area of interpretation that we might have disagreements on. So we got to then find a way when we talk about policy to agree on what is the process to determine who's right or wrong in that.
One of the things we found through our research at the Leadership Center is people a lot of times will say, well, I don't trust so-and-so, in my company, in my organization, so therefore we can't get stuff done. And what we found is you don't need to have trust between people. You need to have everybody trust a process that can help resolve things and do work together. So I appreciate what you're saying. I want to, I don't know how best to ask this tactical question, but Bob, I'm thinking about the list of things that you and I were just talking a little bit about beforehand. We're not going to go into the details, but I think it could be useful for you all to name like the different topics that an ethics policy might need to eventually address. And give an example of one, Bob.
Gifts.
Gifts. So gifts would be one. So what are, could you just name like the other types of things that eventually a policy would need to, we're not gonna talk about what the gift policy should be right now, but like what are those types of topics?
Entertainment.
Say
So
again?
entertainment, so if,
Yep,
you know, is it different if a nonprofit invites you out for their ball and then they advertise you're there to help bring people in? That's entertainment. Is that different than going out to, you know, golf outing with a bunch of friends that
Yep.
has no significant
Yep.
benefit, but also is entertainment? Like where's the difference? Where's the line on that type of stuff? In a legislature, it's just $100. You can do, you know, you get, there is no difference, but for what we do, we get invited to a lot of nonprofit stuff. Like what should we dive deeper into that?
that makes sense.
Meals is probably another one.
Say it again?
Meals.
Niels, yep. Yeah, what else?
We took all the easy ones.
Well, I think friends, because in our current code of ethics, it talks about friends and that you can't vote on anything that affects your friends. And it's like, really? None of us could hold office.
Yeah, you all are pretty friendly people. Yeah, so now we have to define friend.
Yeah.
So is it friends or is it something about like, because what, is that getting at like relationships and is it like the wife example or the husband example
That
of,
says
you know,
shall refrain from making decisions involving friends.
And what defines a friend?
Right.
Is it a person
Yeah.
you grew up with, or is it a person that you built a relationship with while in office? And you know, what's
yeah, what if you quit being friends yesterday?
yeah, right, exactly. We're not friends anymore.
Yeah. But what do you think, Cindy, whoever wrote that, what were they getting at, do you think? I mean, what,
Well, I think they were probably getting at what's later in the policy that talks about using their influence to get things done or doing things that would benefit me as an elected official personally by helping a friend. I think that's probably what it was trying to get at, but it just, it says what I read.
Bob, in city management world, is there a name for that type of?
Yeah, undue influence. is what
Okay.
they-
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be a topic. I mean, the topic of undue influence needs to somehow show up in eventual policy.
There was it's perspective, I think, too, where it gets from like, I think I was okay when I did this, but reasonable interpretation of this, normal people don't think it's okay, where there was a appointee in the last administration who was, I think, the head of commerce, and then they went through the contracts. The contracts happened to all be going to like people he went to college with, people who he played soccer with, really to his friends, but it wasn't people who were friendly to him and, you know, who they had a relationship with, you know, a working relationship in governing. It was people who, you know, showed up at each other's weddings. Like, it was really, it was quite obvious. But I do think that undue influence, like, we need, looking at policy, cleaning this up, making it more, more tight, because that is just open to interpretation.
I love how you said more tight. I mean, stuff like this can never probably be perfectly tight, you know, but more tight than, of course, whatever that statement was that you read. You know, I mean, there's a lot of ground between that and, you know, and something that you all could come up with that would be probably quite helpful to help.
And I think related to that, I don't know if this is another category or, but I think there is some, at least in my mind, there's some kind of confusion about once we have an RFP out, you know, a request for proposals or request for qualifications, and contact with city council. I don't know what that category is. Maybe it falls into this undue influence. Maybe it's all within that.
Can you say more? I don't know if I understand.
Yeah, so I'll give an example.
Okay.
Let's say that we have a request for proposal out on the streets, and someone that's going to bid on that, or has bid on that, and we're now going through a selection process. Is it appropriate for them to contact a council member to try to influence
Thank you.
a decision?
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
And then one of the things we do on the city level, and I don't think any city has this, is let your intentions be known. Where in state level and federal government, you sign up as a lobbyist. You have a list of people that these are next to your name that like, I work on behalf of this interest. And so when someone's talking to you, you kind of have that grain of salt in the back, or in the back of your mind saying, I know that you're on this side, thank you for giving me that information, and then you kind of get to the other side, get that information. City, it's much different that I'm finding, where we don't have, if people are looking for influence, you don't have that kind of formal step forward that lets them know where you're coming from, where like, oh, you're a lobbyist, so I met you, like, so now we have a professional, instead like, oh, you're being very friendly to me, you might build that relationship, and then realize that they're kind of they're lobbying at times. So I think that line gets blurred a little more than it does in some other forms of government, where it's your intention's clear, where we can be friendly, but also your job is to educate on your client's point of view.
Yeah, I learned how many friends I really had when I left the legislature.
Right. It's amazing when you first get
Much
elected.
smaller than I had realized.
All those Christmas cards you get when you first get elected, it's like,
right.
oof,
Yeah.
oh, wow.
Well, but so I do think that there's a point here, though, about how an ethics policy might be about like your all's behavior, but it could also be about the behavior of others.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
I mean, there's a point like at the state level where you have to register as a lobbyist. I mean, like if you're engaging in a certain type of activity with the legislature, you need to be registered, right? And if you don't meet those thresholds, you cannot be registered. But so we could be talking about things that aren't just about your all's behavior and policies that govern you all, but could be policies that govern outside you all. I don't know. Staff could help decide, help discover if other cities have taken steps like that or not.
Well, Bob, don't we have a lobbying policy for the city of Wichita? An anti-lobbying policy?
Yeah, it goes more into what Cindy was talking about in
Yeah.
terms of influence in that regard.
Okay.
Not what the mayor's talking about.
Right.
You know.
So, and I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that a lobbyist in the purest form is an educator, right? This is my client's point of view. And they come out and they say, I'm biased. This is my biased view. Go find the other view too. Like usually it's a point of view, and you kind of start off with that relationship where you know that. And on a city level, I don't think we have anything that kind of makes that so front and center, which, could be good or bad. I'm not saying that we need to do this or that, but yeah, when I looked into it, the compare and contrast, I don't think we had anywhere to set up government relations type, like registration anywhere. And then that's also different too, where you get the lobbyist and you have like a government relations person who might just be trying to build relationships with City Hall because their organization partners on certain things. So, I mean, you get into a whole policy corner, which is kind of fun to talk about, but probably not right now.
Well, and I think you're right, it's probably not now, but it is like something for you all to wrestle with during these conversations is how elaborate do you want this to be? How concise do you want this to be? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I think it's for you all to think about, what amount of directives in a policy will get you the highest compliance with ethical behavior? Sometimes the bigger the policy doesn't mean the more ethical behavior, right? It might just mean the more paper it takes to print the policy, But so those are the types of discussions that you all are gonna have to wrestle with, and you'll get to that. But yeah, there's you can go on lots of rabbit trails, and you can keep it tight. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. Any other, and Bob, if there are any others that you think we should be saying that we're not saying, any other like topic areas? So we have things like gifts, entertainment, meals, undue influence on things like bids or contracts or human resources. We talked about the idea of a process to identify lobbyists or other people who might not call themselves a lobbyist, but who are trying to influence, policy making. Are there other topics that should be on the list, Brian?
I was just thinking of giving knowledge or information that should be privileged, right?
Confidentiality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, finding that balance between transparency and letting people in on, oh, this might
Where they get
be
a leg
later.
up on a contract or.
Yeah.
Or from
Right.
executive session.
Right, so,
Yeah, and like this is, I'm not elected, so this is easy for me to say. It's harder for you all to say, so I'm not gonna make you say it, but, you know, it's hard to be against transparency, but in doing the business of a city, it's also really hard to be totally transparent in everything, right? Because it could lead to things like people have a leg up, right? And so like how, or it involves people's, individuals' rights and
Yeah.
things like that, right? So it feels like confidentiality is a topic, transparency might be a topic too. Others that feel like would need to be topics in a policy that come to mind.
So I think that, sorry, just in our form of government, unless you're in the mayor's position, you're part-time. And we saw in the legislature, people who are part-time, who happen to get really sweet, cushy jobs, with people who also had a legislative agenda. And usually the media calls them out, and we're usually, we've had 2 House reps who had to quit because you had to pick one or the other. But in theory, and this kind of gets to the last, not to get, and I know he's, I'm not talking politics, but I know he's a political lightning rod. Well, like the last Secretary of State who, while using taxpayer money to get one place to another, while they are a taxpayer business, also did private consulting and made more money doing private consulting than on the on the taxpayer role. So that blending, I think, of an outside career and governing, where is talking about those parameters, where it's okay for Bob to go teach over at Wichita State. Like that's really good for our students in a community, and there's no conflict there. Is it okay for a company that's trying to contract millions of dollars with the city to also hire Bob as a consultant? Probably not okay, right? So what is, sorry, Bob, I know. Yeah, sorry, Bob, don't mean to throw you under there, but and we tried in the legislature at one point with an amendment to say, if you're a governor, if you are full-time, like this is it, like you have to serve. Like you can't go get a full-time job with some group that has influence. But I think that's the balance that's very tough for.
Yeah, so it seems like one of the topics to be explored then, and that could be in a policy, would be conflicts of interest related to other income that electeds are bringing in, which feels different than like a conflict of interest around undue influence or something like that. I mean, it could be related, but it feels like it's like a cousin to that topic, but it feels like a distinctly different thing. Yeah, that makes sense.
And one of the things that we have to report as elected officials are statements of substantial interest.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's already common knowledge if we have outside employment or if our partners or spouses have our outside employment. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's something we're already doing, and there isn't, no reason not to do it because we're already doing it well now, right?
Right, yeah.
So,
But where's the balance? Just because we report it, does that mean it's okay? That's my point, where if you report it and you're out there, but you're term limited, you get the last 4 years, let's say, is it okay at that point? And that's one of the interesting things with term limits is, if you're term limited and you're just there for 4 years and you look for your next gig and someone hires you before the next gig, and you're kind of an extension of that, do you run into ethical problems? So that's not saying that ever happens here, but we do read case studies where that type of stuff happens.
Say that again, explain that to me.
So like, let's say one of the unintended consequences of term limits is that someone, let's say, I'm gonna use you as an example, and I love you, Jeff, so I don't mean this way. Let's say you're term limited out, you're looking for your next job, or someone is, and they come and approach you and they say, we want you to work with
Favorable
us.
treatment to somebody you
Right,
you
well,
might
they're
want to get
paying
a
you
job
now as a
with.
consultant, but they also have a vested interest in contracts and stuff. And although you report it and the media beats you up, and you're kind of paid to take those hits at that point. Where like, yeah, but you can't get rid of me, and I'm not running for re-election. I have no incentive to not do that. So that's why if you have a good ethics policy, you put in those parameters where like the incentive to not do that is you're violating policy, and you have to go through the triggers that gets you in trouble. So yeah, so that's what, and like I said, that doesn't happen here. I'm not saying it does, but we have case studies where that type of stuff happens.
One topic would be, what teeth does the policy have? What is the consequence? Because the current policy just says not to do it. And there's no process in play for what type of offense regards what type of consequence.
Yeah, I thought it was a real nice document that the staff put together that described the two different types of policies, you know, the aspirational versus the enforceable. So, yeah, having clarity in the policy about what are the teeth to
Yeah.
this, yeah.
And the type of triggers where it doesn't become political, where, you know, you're not just, we really don't like that guy, so we're gonna vote to, you know, if the body only does it themselves and it doesn't have, then they can, politics can play, relationships can play where it's not balanced. But if you have like a trigger that automatically brings in legal, brings in an outside law firm, brings in a board that's set up, the process gets back to that, where how do we ensure that if you meet this threshold, it gets triggered and you're now going through the process.
Yeah, makes sense. So teeth, triggers, others, but if it's okay with you all, can we go about 10 more minutes before break? What are your norms here about breaks?
There is no norm.
Sometimes
There is no
sometimes he holds us in here 5 hours with no break.
Until I did it, yes. Very clever. Very clever. Luckily, we're not driving to any yeses today, so we can take a break any
Seltzer.
sooner. So
Yeah.
10, maybe 15 at the most, but we'll stop. At the most, we'll have a break no later than 20 till at the top of the hour.
So Ed, maybe this is in that list of undue influence, because I heard you say HR, but I think another category is elected officials' influence on like hiring decisions, and maybe there's some other categories in that we should or should not have undue influence, personally have influence on. So I think that's a category of, maybe it was in one of those.
Yeah. When you look at policies, sometimes they put that in a broad category of patronage, but it also, and I think Ed, when he was talking about undue influence a little while ago, mentioned HR as well. So
Okay.
I've written that out as a separate.
Would it be also beneficial to expand that maybe, and I'm not saying you do this, Bob, but since the city manager has the ability to award contracts up to $50,000 without necessarily coming to us, so not putting that undue influence on the city manager as well, like I have a partner who can do this really well, $10,000 cheaper than that, like something like that.
Yeah, those are the kinds of things I'm talking about,
Yeah.
us having that.
So us
us having-
influencing staff.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Just real quick, that's a really good example too. As you go from the aspirational policy you currently have that doesn't have much to it, and you try to create something more elaborate, you end up getting the opportunity to get more clear on those types of questions.
Right.
And ideally, work it thoughtfully enough so that you have something that kind of works. That doesn't bog things down, but actually helps people have confidence in their city, and you all have confidence in what you're doing, so.
I think you just said a word that is really important, and that's confidence. We really do want people to have confidence in our city, not necessarily us, but we're an extension, so by extension us. If people have confidence that we're doing the right thing, if they have confidence that they're being served, that goes a long way when there are flub ups and slip ups, and because nobody's perfect, but that really goes a long way with I think citizens as a whole. There are a lot of cities, and I've got to be honest. There are a lot of cities that don't have near the confidence in that of their citizens that we do. I mean, we've really done a lot over the past 8 years to kind of change from the days of some of our I won't say older leadership, but leadership of the past, you know, and some of the things that everybody knew was going on, to really, and I'm not trying to stroke you, Bob, but you know, when you were hired, there was a new culture that was ushered in, started to be ushered in a new way of doing business, and I learned a lot about Bob very quickly, about his ethics and his standards and the things that he holds, and I think he's brought that to the city, and it just really filtered to the city council. And so We really do, but we have a long way to, that being said, we have a long way to go too. We really do. And so confidence, I think that's a key word. I need to highlight that since you said it.
Well, and let's use that to bridge to the next question. So the next question is, when you think about ethics reform for the city council, what are your greatest aspirations? Okay. So I hear you describing an aspiration, like,
Yeah.
you want, what I wrote down is people have confidence we are doing the right thing. You said it more eloquently than that, but, so what are your aspirations for this?
Not too much more eloquently.
And this is, we know this is not technical, this is adaptive, right?
Yeah.
But if I had my dream, it would be so clearly defined that how Brian interprets it, or Jeff interprets it, or Brandon interprets it, and how I interpret it is all the same. And I think that's probably impossible, but as close to that as we can get. I think all of us, there are some things, we know if it's over $500, or we know if it's under this, or we know it's whatever. But, when you get into friends or other topics, it gets a little more wonky,
Yeah.
for lack of a better word. So a true aspiration would be that it's extremely clearly defined as much as it can be.
Love it, love it. Let's keep going. Other aspirations, things that you might even think legacy stuff a little bit too. Like, imagine being gone. Imagine being done with your service, and people are talking about, the ethics policy. And I assume you hope this lasts longer than just while you're here. I assume that you hope that this is something that, and I shouldn't state that, I'm stating an aspiration that you might not hold, but don't be afraid to think, long term. What other aspirations that come to your mind?
I would say a trustworthy, citizen-informed process.
And I'll dovetail off that, where it's usually in government, you're looking for not, hey, trust me, don't ask any questions. What you're looking for is that benefit of the doubt, where if something comes through either on media or non-traditional media and you hear something, or the public hears something, they say, well, I want to hear their side first before I rush to judgment. And when you have that, where, yeah, we had to do this because of budgets, like, you're right, but they didn't give the background, it's because of, we had a choice between this or that. When you have that kind of benefit of the doubt, where then you've created, I think, that relationship where it's that balance between, I think, trust and accountability, where you're not just being thrown under the bridge because no one trusts the system anymore, there's no parameters, but it's not just all out, you do what you want, we're not going to look at it anymore because we already trust you. Like, you want that balance, and I think the key to that balance, at least in my public service, has been, we heard this, can you tell us the rest of the story? And then you can kind of fill in that, that gap on, yeah, we voted that way, but also that bill was this little piece that we thought we can get out if we killed it. So in my experience, that's been a balance. And the last thing I'll say about this is those parameters. It's not so much about us, because we're gonna have different people who serve in this role, but also people who want to interact with us, right? Where people who want to do business with the city, let's say if they're in, I guess I'll throw Missouri under the bus. There's no limits in Missouri. It's a Wild West. There's no limits as far as like campaign donations or any of that stuff. So I don't want to be in a position where someone comes in with like a $10,000 check, pushes it across my desk, and it's made out to my campaign and says, like, we'd really like you to look at this bill, right? Like, no one wants to be there, so in that position. So if you have those parameters, like you do in a legislature, where you can't give more than this amount of money, you can't do more than that as far as campaign contributions or entertainment, it allows people serving and those who want to do business have those boundaries so that they know when they're crossing them.
So just to elaborate, the reason I said citizen informed is if the citizens had a great deal of input on it, they'll trust it more because they helped say that. So when this all came up last year, I know I started talking about the gifts piece, and as people talked about ethics, I would say, so how do you feel about lunches or coffees or shirts or tickets from nonprofits? And if the citizens say they're okay with us getting coffee and not lunch, even though we don't get influenced by lunch, if the policy says you can only have coffee, Well, then the public had input on that, and they said you can only have coffee. So that way, when they see a coffee, they know they were okay with that. If they see any more, they weren't, and now they wouldn't trust that part of it. So that's why I say citizen influenced.
For sure, because you get buy-in, and also it makes it purposeful. You're not just being ethical to be ethical, where like we're cutting off all coffees and lunch because they buy votes. Like everyone knows that coffee's not gonna sway you, you know, but private airplane trips to the Bahamas looks a lot different, you know, so where's that balance? And a lot of times people put a price on it, but I think that going out, what is socially acceptable in our community, what's the Wichita way, helps us define that.
And let's keep going on aspirations for a little bit. And I'm not asking you all to agree with one another right now, but I'm hoping that this is helping you all get a sense of where each other's aspirations reside for this. And my guess is, as we're having this conversation, there's a lot of overlap. There might be some areas that don't overlap perfectly, you know, and that's fine. And the process will help. The process after today will help flesh out that. But figuring out like what are the aspirations, and there's already a lot of, my guess, overlap, you know, and it's okay if there's not too. Like, so don't worry. Like, I don't know if I completely buy that. We're not asking you all to agree to this right now. We're just trying to get these aspirations out on the table. What else comes to your mind about aspirations for this?
Well, I'll bring up something that a citizen had mentioned, and I guess it kind of fits. Mayor reminded me. So when you look at campaign donations, I have seen citizens concerned where businesses can donate to candidates, but then we're also awarding contracts to businesses. And there's questions of whether there's influence there. So is that something that the council or candidates for council will accept, business contributions, or just focus on the individual?
And Brendan, if I can add to that, also PACs have come up. A few years ago, before I was on council, there was a decision that we could accept funds up to $500, a legal campaign contribution from a PAC. And there's been some discussions I've heard recently that maybe that should also be reviewed. So if we're thinking about businesses, I think that would be important to include, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that was my first year on council when we voted, and it was a split council. So to allow PACs and businesses to donate to campaigns. And
One of the basis for that wasn't necessarily because the council wanted to be able to glean
No, it
that
was
money, but there was a Supreme Court decision
Right.
that we were trying to fall in line with. So
Yeah.
at the same time, so when looking at that policy, we need to be careful about any national rulings or those sorts of things that would impact, you know, donations. But honestly, even individuals, so when individuals give to our campaigns, we get blasted for that too. I mean, because there are individuals that own companies that come before us and want, so you're not ever going to really get away with, or, you know, get away from being able to separate the business from the individual and coming in front of us. So those are always real tough, because at every level of government right now, businesses and individuals and PACs are giving, you know, to campaigns. And so I'm willing to look at the policy, obviously, and refine it even more. But it's always touchy. It's always a touchy thing, because even with our limits that we have, which really $500 is, to a lot of people, it's a lot of money, but to a campaign, it's really a drop in the bucket normally, you know. And so I think that it's always been difficult. There's always been false allegations too that have been made. And you know, at one point I was telling one of the people in, I think my second or third campaign, can't remember, hey, let's talk about it. Let's investigate, you know. And
James, let me ask you this, because you've been around for a while. You're one of the
Thanks
old
a
guys.
lot, yeah.
Yeah, no problem. So as a part of the, when allegations happen in the past, how are they resolved? And as part of this process to get clear
Yeah.
on, like, what would be the process for that in the future? What do you think?
There's never been a resolution to it. That's why, you tell those people making the allegations, I would love, let's do some sort of investigation if you're really that concerned, and normally people will back off, right? But I don't know that we've ever really resolved anything.
Yeah.
And most of those accusations are always politically motivated.
Yeah.
Because someone doesn't like a decision you've made, or,
Sure.
and so they lash out in emotional anger over it. But nothing's ever really been resolved.
And I apologize for being a bit naive on this, but I did read those memos, I promise, but I don't remember all of them. But if somebody would say, well, yeah, let's do an investigation, there isn't like a literal process. for
No,
how that would
not at
happen.
all.
Where, so there's one example of like the different avenues to go down. Again, I know the mayor's familiar with it at the state level, there is a process, and sometimes people say, see, we went through the process and everything's cleared.
Yeah.
You know, or see, we went through the process and yeah, there was something there that was valid. And I don't know what the right thing for you all to do or not, but that's like another area, another topic would be like, what's the process? Hearing a couple things. One, a process for when there is conflict that feels like it's relevant to be resolved. How does that happen? And then also another topic does feel to be like electioneering versus the business of government. Those feel like two different things that probably this policy might need to address.
In campaign finance, I think, I get excited with talk about that, but they have traditionally been two separate policies. I think it's interesting, it gets us a little more versus local government versus state government, where when you accept a contribution from a PAC or from let's say a union, a PAC, something that's traditionally a political entity, there's a mission statement, right? Like you can actually track, okay, your Kansas for Better Schools, let's say, this is their mission statement. Their PAC is set up to do this. Also, you trace it, it's registered with the Secretary of State. Like there's a process to kind of learn about how a candidate, who's supporting a candidate and what the interests are. What's interesting, I find, is that the exploitation of certain loopholes where Ed can give me $500 and that's not going to influence my vote because as James says, $500, that's maybe some palm cards. Like that's not, you're not flipping an election that way. Yeah. But if Ed, let's say, owns 64 different LLCs, now Ed's a big player, where Ed and his wife can give money and then now all of his now Ed's donation isn't just $500. Now your donation is $30,000, and all those LLCs could just have these kind of shadow, strange names, that you kind of put them all in, and then it's very tough to figure out. You have to really, I think, go through that extra layer of, okay, who's really behind this or that, and then you find out. Then you can match them up and figure it out. But as some detective work, that's where I think, and it's illegal right now to do that type of stuff. That's where it gets interesting in campaign finance, is when you figure out who's somewhat kind of exploiting that system where, your LLCs are people now, so you can become
Right.
all these different people and then kind of funnel money towards candidates, and then you see where these powers are.
Can I ask a question?
It's going to be the final statement.
Thank you. This is a
and then
really-
we'll go to a break, so we'll answer it after the break. But go
Okay,
ahead.
this is a really technical question. Mayor, you just said like somebody could donate $30,000 through all their LLCs, so that would mean they would have 60 LLCs, right? Does that happen?
Yes, 100%.
That one person has 60 LLCs?
One person.
But numerous. You can have as many LLCs.
I know you can have as many as you want, I'm just asking if that.
There is one person who's very, very influential in city politics. He has 64 LLCs.
Okay, thank you.
And I can point you to the funding reports if you wanted me to
No,
map it
I'm
out for
okay.
you.
I was just trying to figure out if that was even.
Oh, yeah.
Hypothetical, if it was.
Sadly, that happens.
Let's do a
Yeah.
break. Let's come back at 5 till.
Can I say one thing because we lit up? I just wanted to say that, whenever we did change the rule with the PACs and everything, it was because we were trying to mirror state and county and everybody else, just like we do all of our others. So I just want to make sure
With the
had
court.
that out there.
Well, and I also think there are differences between ethics policies and campaign finance policies.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they connect, but they are
But they
different
are
things. So,
different.
back at 5 till 4.
Okay.
Oh, wow, that's
Is that a long break for you all?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
let's keep going for a bit on this idea of aspirations. I'd love to hear more. What are your aspirations for this? You're going to do this work. It's just beginning right now. I don't know when the finish line is. You don't know when the finish line is, but when you get through that finish line, what are the aspirations? We've had a lot of good stuff. People have confidence that we're doing the right things. A common interpretation among us. Trustworthy, citizen-informed process. Another one was the policy creates a benefit of the doubt. It helps balance trust and accountability. Right? The policy does that, right? It's like the policy does work for you, right? Rather than you all having to do the work yourselves, right? The policy actually does some of that work for you. It guides us and those who want to interact with us. That was an interesting aspiration. Clarity regarding, I wrote this one down, these are my words, not your all's words, but when we got to talking about campaign finance and election, I mean, so clarity around what of this is campaign finance reform, what of this is ethics reform. Again, those are related and they are different, they overlap. But clarity on how they overlap in this conversation feels like an aspiration. What else for aspirations that you want from this?
A particular common standard, I think, where what are cities that are known to be the best at this? What do they look like? Because I think Wichita, we should be the best, right? If we're going to do this, let's do it. Let's be the best at it. And so that balance between having functional policy that doesn't interfere with legitimate work. So other cities, I'm sure, have figured that out. And how can we take what they're doing, make the Wichita way to do it, but make it one of those, if you're teaching a class on local government ethics, Wichita is a new textbook.
Yeah, we're the model.
Yeah, we have a chance to be that. And because, I mean, that's an awesome opportunity, right? Like, because we're doing this, but that's, what is the common, I want a professor who teaches this to look at our policy and say, oh yeah, it hits all three of the main pillars, let's say. So
The idea of the model, not a model, right? So like
why
Wichita
not?
State wants to be the model, right, Cindy?
We're the shining example.
Exactly.
Do it right.
Yeah. So you remember what the word, the model for applied learning and research?
Yes.
Not a model, the model.
We had lots of discussion.
Lots of discussion and debate about A versus the,
That
A
was
versus
at
the.
Wichita State?
No, not that. The model,
Yeah, the model.
the model.
Yeah, I mean, y'all get how that elevates the work we're doing, right? And again, that's something for you all to think about. If there's agreement, we're not looking for agreement today, but there's agreement on the model versus a model, that's a loftier aspiration. Yeah, what else? Bob thought you had more to say on aspirations. I was gonna move to the next question, but he said, no, we gotta stay on aspirations. So Bob knows
speak your heart,
there's some
Bob.
additional brilliance.
Just a little longer.
Yeah.
Well, so here's something, and I don't know exactly how this fits either, but as I look through the document that Jennifer's staff put together for us, there are things in here about training of the elected officials in ethics, whatever policy we come up with. So I think that an aspiration should be that we have some sort of training period, process.
Continuous learning or just
Like continuing
one
ed
set?
or?
I think when you're first on, and maybe
on.
some reminders that,
So like when we do our onboarding?
Yeah.
There's also an onboarding that you're participating in for that?
yes.
And we kind of have that
Yeah.
set up already where, and we can take it a step further, because I think that if we wind up getting into the mechanics, and I could be wrong, and I'm not trying to project my vision of how this legislation is going to look, but our legal also is the parliamentarian, right? So knows the rules, is legal. They might be able to serve somewhat as that resource. Hey, Jennifer, this person just slipped a $5,000 check across my desk and told me that they're doing it because they really like my haircut. Can I accept that? Have someone on the other end say, no, you can't. Like have that, right now it's the Kansas Ethics Commission that can do that for state people. But if the person who also is kind of making those opinions, and if our ordinance already determines that person is the person who makes the decisions already for procedural motions, it makes sense that, and then they do the onboarding, that they could kind of extend that. It wouldn't be too much of a disruption if they're later looped in and they do the ethical onboarding afterwards and kind of just let people know that, you know, you could be approached this way or that way, and this is what's expected.
I think we already have that, but it probably could be maybe more formalized.
It could be-
Well, we can't onboard you, I mean, what this allows, this policy would really help focus what the training is, right?
Yeah.
And set future training opportunities.
Right. Yeah, I was seeing what the
I
mayor said
also
about.
think there's something deeper to what you're saying, though, or different to what you're saying, related to, an aspiration could be that this leads to ongoing training, which
Yeah.
implies something, right, to the city, right? I mean, if you do training when you're onboarded on ethics, and then you never talk
Yeah.
about it again, versus you do ongoing, what it's implying is that,
It's always front and center.
it's always front and center, but also that it's not just like evildoers who will go do unethical things.
Yeah.
That it's like we all have to continue to learn and think about this and be reflective.
Yeah.
And that's where my mind went when you talked
Yeah,
about
I think
ongoing training, is
No,
what
that
it,
makes a
not
lot
only
of
could be
sense.
useful for people, but what it could apply to citizens.
Yeah, yeah, I think that sends a good message.
The reason I want to stay on aspiration for a minute, I'll just be blunt, is I think you're missing a guiding principle that will help you as you put all of this together. And the reason I say that is when we were doing the staff, when we were putting together a revised code of ethics, which we kind of put on hold until the council finishes its work, our guiding principle was that we wanted, everything we did, we wanted to be above reproach. So everything, as we put all the elements together, that was the standard that we kept looking at. When people look at, you know, exceptions to a rule, does that mean that we still follow the standard of being above reproach? And that's the only thing I wanted to throw out there is if there's some aspiration that is overarching that then helps, that serves as your test every time you look at an element of your policy. And that's Ed, I probably should articulate.
No, I think it's great. Thoughts, reactions?
I think it's.
Can it withstand sunlight or the attention? I would say everything that we do should be able to be seen in the public with no issue to it, if I said that right. Just thinking through.
Yeah.
You know, but one of the things we run into, and we're constantly being criticized for, is the openness of some of our, the organizations we support to do work for us, like WDDC or Visit Wichita. And though I know those organizations are above reproach, we look at that, right? But the public knows there's some public dollars going into those organizations, and how do we move them along as well? Any organizations we're supporting with tax dollars, you know, how are they aware of our policies, and how can they be, how can they reflect some of those policies as well? But at the same time, understanding, just like a business, they do have their own confidentiality needs as well. And when you say something is confidential, and you know there's tax dollars that are going into that organization, all of a sudden, everybody always thinks the negative first. Oh, something's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Something's going on. So how do we mix that with what we're doing here?
So the question I would have is the issue of sunshine. It actually goes back to the very first statement that was made by Jeff, and that is that how does it look on the front page of the paper? The other standard we used to have was, what would your mom say? And so, which was another simple rule like we used to talk about in training. But that sunshine, is that the standard you want to use at the aspirational standard? How does it look to the public, or how does it look in the sunshine? If exposed, I mean, I don't know, but it seems you've already talked about that a couple of times.
Ed, can I just add, pardon me, when we're talking about aspirations again, it may take me a sec to get there, but I promise I will. But if we look at the problems that are perceived, if somehow we could address them early, and the example I would give would be during the last election and campaign, I cannot tell you the number of times exhaustively people talked about backroom deals, and they were tired of city council making backroom deals. And I kept saying, I don't even know what that means. Like, if there's a backroom deal happening, I've never seen it, I've never seen it anywhere. If there would, I wouldn't tolerate it. So if there was something in this policy that then when people make those false claims, we could say, no, look, here it is, and this is how we're addressing it. Does that make sense? Can anybody clarify more?
So on that, the point you made earlier, when we get into the non-disclosure events, the biggest thing I can think of is the $1 an acre with the baseball that fired up. We've got to be able to communicate that had to be done to get the deal together, and instead of the narrative that it was a backroom deal and that everybody was out trying to do something that the public wasn't knowledgeable about. We've got to be able to communicate that message.
Well, and I think, again, I'm an outsider just trying to be helpful, right? So, you know, all of my thoughts have question marks at the end of them, and all of them can be dismissed, okay? You won't hurt my feelings. But I hear, Becky, you're getting to the idea of, can the process do some work?
Yeah.
Right? So like the existence of this process, this policy, could it actually help do some work that would give the confidence that, you know, James, you were talking about?
Thank you for saying that better than I did.
But you got it there. But I think that's a key thing for you all to think about, because absent, because what happened in the last election is all you could say was what you were saying, right?
Yeah.
All you say is, I don't know. I mean, you have to, and so if you all can craft something that you can all agree on, that then would give you and citizens confidence of an answer that is beyond what you were able to give, and help to give the process do the work rather than you having to do the work. That makes sense?
Yeah, and I'll own this. I mean, I sometimes felt defensive because people can say anything, right?
Yeah.
And it's hurtful when people said, oh, backroom deals and lining their pockets, and I'm like, that's not even true, and there's nothing to substantiate that, so that makes it even harder. So having something that we can lean into to say no, and you know.
Yeah.
And I think those parameters are gonna be really important with that, because right now, we don't have any parameters that says, you know, someone can't take an elected official on an expensive vacation. We don't have that. You might have to report it, you know, in the substantial interest form if you do, but there's nothing that stops that at the city level, but there is in Tulsa. There is in Oklahoma City. There is in, you know, even Kansas City, Missouri, of all places, has one of the best ethics, you know, laws at the city level. So when you don't even have those parameters in place where the organization hasn't actually been able to say, we have parameters in place that prevent that, and if anybody is doing that stuff, then they are actually violating the policy. And I think that policy really reflects the values of an organization. So I think that's important, and that's one of the things that we can change here is by creating, at the very least, not just the parameters for elected officials, but how those on the outside play ball with the city, or where, you know, if you cross this line, you're the one crossing that line. So the line's observed on both sides.
That makes sense.
So jumping into Sunshine, I didn't want to bring like all of my suggestions today, but one thing that I was talking to folks about in the fall was, if you are that interested in dinners and coffees, I wouldn't mind having some Excel spreadsheet that says on this date, I had a coffee, it was $3.75 with this person. Even if it was a topic over something that may come before council, so there's some development they wanted to talk about, say riverfront development, I wouldn't mind doing that. And Sunshine, you'd see I did have those coffees, the dates and times. And if somebody says, well, why did you have 10 coffees with this person? And then I could talk about the conversations that we had. So just stuff like that, so folks can see the openness. And I know that's like really detailed, but it's kind of what I was alluding to.
And the goal, I think, is to, and I agree with that. I think that the goal is to make sure that the next people who replace us also have that standard to follow, which is why I think this policy gets beyond the people in the current seat. It's because you could be tweeting, this is my expenses this week, I went to this, these people bought me coffee, and it's out there, it's public. But
Bless you.
the next person might not. So I think that's what gives us such a really great opportunity here, is to kind of put in that standard of this is the standard, and then those people go above and beyond that. And make it purposeful, make it so it's not just, like, oh, I'm ethical because I report every cup of coffee or every lunch, I pay for every lunch that someone takes out, but, it's symbolic more at that point, because it's not, like, because like no one's swayed about coffee or lunch. It's like, did you also get on a private plane? Like, that's different, like, so kind of creating those parameters and making sure that it's purposeful and it makes sense, not just a show, I think. And that's why I think that strong policy does that, and then we can always personally go above and beyond it.
A couple things just run through my head. One of them, Bob, to your point about guiding principles. First, if you all have more thoughts on that, it'd be good to get those out now. I wonder, again, I'm the outsider, but I wonder if these notes, looking at these notes, a guiding principle or two might emerge from the conversation that the staff could perhaps put back and say, we think we heard you collectively say this. Did you? That's one thought. The second thought is, you all are doing what I'm doing. You're listening to this conversation, and there's a lot of good stuff to it. And we shouldn't be naive and say there aren't real philosophical differences to the ways this can head, and that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But one of the dynamics that seems to be alive in these types of conversations is, if you imagine a continuum of, on one side, it's transparency and disclosure. On the other side, it's what's permitted and what's allowed, right? And like those are different philosophical approaches. Like one philosophical approach might be, we want everything disclosed, we want everything transparent, but we're not going to dictate behavior beyond disclosing. Another way of thinking about these types of policies is, we are going to have a policy that says what you can and cannot do, right? And I'm not here to say which one's the right approach, but like you can imagine, just if you listen to the conversation, the continuum that exists there, and where people fall on a continuum has a lot to do with all sorts of things. But as you all wrestle with this, I imagine that'll be some of the stuff you'll wrestle with. Is where can you all get agreement, for the council, and maybe you can get agreement on everything, and maybe you can't. But sometimes just being able to name, like, what could some of the tension points be can be useful. We're going to end right at 5, because my family will be upset if we don't, and some people have birthday parties to go to and things like that. So we're not going to be late. Any other thoughts on the guiding principle thing? Anything else you want to just say about that before I give you the next question? Okay. So the last question was, when you think about ethics reform for the city council, what are your greatest aspirations? This is the reverse of that question now. When you think about ethics reform in the city, what concerns you the most?
A potential policy, or just right now?
I would say like this process. Like when you think about this process of creating a new policy, when you think about a new policy, what concerns you the most?
Getting it wrong.
What's that?
Getting it wrong.
Okay. And maybe just keep talking there about say more about that.
Well, since we haven't engaged the public fully at just, coming up with something that is just not acceptable to our voters, the citizens of Wichita, and going through all of this and not having it kind of nailed down in a way that's seen as acceptable.
Yeah, that's my biggest fear too. That maybe it's not acceptable even to the public, but also, I mean, what we make out of this, particularly with the last campaign, will make news. It will be reviewed by academics. It will absolutely get a grade, And so I think if we get it wrong, just like my colleague says, we could actually get, I think, worse pushback than by not having anything at all. Like, it has to be more than a show. Like, let's put teeth in it. Let's make it real. That's my biggest fear, is that, we get it wrong.
And I want to keep going on this one. The reason why this question is so important, my experience working in public life and private life is that mitigating these concerns is critical, right? And the way you mitigate them isn't by thinking about the content of a policy. It's to think about how you work to develop that policy, right? So it's like each of you have a role to play in mitigating these concerns, right? But it's different than talking about policy, right? It's something different. So naming these things that are concerns are useful. What else comes to mind?
So maybe isn't, because I have the same concerns that were expressed earlier, but this is a concern of mine, is hurting nonprofits. Because right now, we are invited to nonprofit events by the nonprofit, by sponsors, or by someone else who's in some way supporting those nonprofits. And so I have a concern about how we handle that.
No.
So.
And those events, just to dovetail, those events, when pre-COVID, we would be invited to several a month, maybe all year long, and you kind of pick and choose. It's so to a regular citizen, they'd say, "Oh, you're going to a really nice dinner," and you know what? It's work.
Yeah.
And the unintended consequence, I agree 100%. And that's what the Wichita way to do it. And that's different than a legislature, because the legislature, we couldn't do that. But there are people who go to the events, like the nonprofits will actually advertise that we're at them
Right.
to bring in people. And during COVID, my wife and I, for Humankind, we got to, for their Speak Out, Sleep Out, read a bedtime story, but we did it through Zoom, right? And they got to advertise that. And so Lacey Cruz did hers. And so anyways, our culture here in Wichita is to have council members and the mayor do stuff, but it helps the nonprofit. Like they would actually, and to be honest, like eating rubber chicken over at some ballroom on a weekend, like that's not, like when Councilmember Clendenin says, oh, you're out for a nice dinner. Like, no, it's work. Like, you're out there shaking hands. It's work. It's not. But the intended consequence, if we did this wrong, is that it would hurt some of our nonprofit community, education community.
I can't count the times when somebody has wanted me to come over to their table in the middle of dinner, and I've gotten up to go talk to somebody, and I took 2 bites of my dinner, and they came and cleaned it and left.
Right.
It's all the
No,
time.
yeah.
I guess I'll eat later.
You go to Taco Bell on the way home.
You don't always eat at these things, right? And so it is work, but I guess there is, I think, and understandably, a disconnect between the public and how they perceive those events and the realities of what those events are for us. And so even WSU basketball games, I've missed half the games sometimes. You go because you want to be seen as supporting the university. Mm-hmm. You want to be, but you talk to people. The person in front, behind you, we know who you are. So I got a problem with it. It's inevitable. And so, I don't know how you handle those things, but it does concern me a little bit that our policy would at least have the flexibility for us to continue to do that work in the community.
Yeah, and I think that we got to figure. Sorry, just real quick. Let me know if there's a difference between going to Child Starts event and then going up to the Chiefs game. Yeah. And that's what I think. If we had, one is a community event that helps a nonprofit. The other one is just, hey, I got a bunch of Chief tickets, come sit in my box with me. That's the difference. So I agree that there's definitely a difference with that. And I'm sorry, Jeff, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Since you brought up the point of WSU tickets, is that something that we need to look at for sporting events? Is there an ethical issue where we vote on a mill every year for WSU and we receive sporting tickets
And
from them?
they hired Bob for a teaching job.
Hey.
How did that go?
Bob went through quite a while before we started blaming him, by the way, so it was a pretty good meeting for Bob.
Jeff, I think it's a great question, and I think it's, to me, what I hear you saying is, one of the things I'm concerned about is, we get through this process and we still have that question, we don't have clarity on it, then maybe we didn't do this process correctly. Who knows what the answer should be, but let's make sure that we get clarity.
I guess I throw the question out there because I wonder, what does the public think of that?
Yeah, yeah. And we are going to shift in just a couple minutes to talking about, not deciding how you all get public input, but beginning to think about how would that best work. I'd love to hear some more concerns. The things that you want to make sure the staff, your colleagues, and yourself are working to mitigate as you go through this process.
Oh,
I liked yours a lot. That was really good. It's hard to top that one.
Well, I have another one. I just have a concern that we tie our hands in helping neighborhoods, helping economic development, helping whatever it is. And I don't know, because we're not talking about the details today, but as we think about an ethics policy, there's that balance, right, between the things that we've talked about today, and we don't want to stifle the things that work well.
Well, I don't know if this goes exactly to an example of what you're saying, but it popped into my head when you said it, so I'm going to say it. We have several times we've had a council member or mayor fly on the private jet of someone who is trying to go up and get a deal done to bring somebody here, or it was legitimate work.
Right.
And my goodness, saving the taxpayer money by hopping on, a jet, flying up there. We are the air capital. To the normal person, they'd think, but at the same time, you're doing the business of the city, and you're legitimately, one of the great ones I think of is Southwest Airlines. We wouldn't have Southwest Airlines here in Wichita if something like that hadn't happened.
And James, just to dovetail in that, I'm pretty sure that when the chamber does the city-to-city trips, aren't they private jets?
I think they're chartered.
But donated by companies. But so I mean, what I hear you saying is, and tell me if I'm wrong, that sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not. You don't want to fix a problem you don't have, right?
Well, I see this as saving taxpayers money on travel. Other taxpayers would say, well, that's quite a perk, and so again, it's all about perspective. But when we talk about some of those, I don't know if that really is.
No, that was.
So the process, I think, is important too, where if the parliamentarian, legal, someone makes that opinion public beforehand that this is why this is happening. Because I do think that, I've never been on a private jet and feel kind of embarrassed that might be one of the only ones in the room who hasn't. But
No, I've never been on.
No, the idea that, I think there's a big difference where you're going down to meet with Southwest to try to bring them here to our airport. That's a big difference than hitching a ride to some vacation somewhere. So if you made a concrete technical couple lines there where none of that type of gifts, and you didn't have a way to what about if it's a different circumstance? Then I think that gets back to the process where, okay, well, what if the circumstance dictates that this is going to bring jobs here?
Yeah, it's again, there's a lot here about letting the process do work, right? Letting you be able to say, well, we got this great process that, and so letting the process do the work, let the process give the confidence to the people that, no, it's okay in this situation, and it wasn't okay in that situation, and there must be a clear reason as to why. Brian, hop in, you were trying to get in a second ago.
Yeah, just another idea is that I'm afraid if we put so tight limits and definitions on part-time jobs, business associates, friends, that we start to limit our pool as to who could succeed us.
It's true.
And then we get, we don't have the well-rounded breadth of experience that you want in an elected official. And then you end up with just retired folks, and I'm not trying to disparage any group, but the people that then can do that job is such a small subset that you miss out.
That's really
No, I think piggybacking on that, I guess another fear would be just around the term friends and what does that mean? Because I know how I define that. So I've got friends I grew up with. If they're trying to do business with the city, I'd stay out of all of that.
Absolutely.
But I've also met people while being in office that are kind of like friends, so if they came before the city, do I abstain on all of that too? Or, so what is that definition? Our job is to build relationships.
You're a friendly guy?
But so that, I guess that part, I'm worried about, because I do believe any elected official should be building relationships, in that you build friendships. And then what does that look like when items come before the council to vote?
Because I think one of the beauties of the electeds that we have now is it's not so heavily bureaucratic that it's just nothing but professional politicians representing the citizens. It's like the rest of the community. And I think that helps, but we've got to take these steps to make sure it doesn't hurt.
I'll offer a potential concern that I could imagine if I was still in elected office would be on my mind. It's hard to speak when you're wrestling with policies like this. It's hard to speak against an idea for more ethics, right? So it can be sometimes in the who's going to oppose better ethics? Well, nobody. But it's like the pressure to be in favor of more ethics can lead you to unintended consequences. That none of you want. And so a concern that I could imagine would be alive and well in any city council having this conversation would be, we need to do this so it works. We don't want to do this so we don't, we just need to make sure we do this in a way that doesn't lead us into a situation where we're on the record with all the right sound bites of saying we're in favor of ethics reform and the right votes, and we now have a situation where nobody wants to run for office. Work can't get done, right? So you all have to find that balance somehow, and there's some awkwardness sometimes in finding that balance when the people who the policy is about are the ones creating the policy. So just naming that feels relevant, at least.
And especially like with the Friends thing or different things. I remember a couple times last year, I have my own policies. I follow all the other, policies, but it's almost then a fear of paralysis of, oh my gosh, I've known this person for 10 years. Is it okay if I'm seen going to lunch with them? Because now it could be the misconception of. Yep. And so some of it too is, I hope there's a level of trust. I don't think this is an inappropriate thing to say. None of us would be elected if we didn't know people, right? You have to know people to get elected. And so then, it's this, I could just see this spiral of, I'm probably not articulating it very well, but you have to have some connections and friends to be able to do the work that you do and to get input from people who are content experts and your constituents. And if we try and box it in so much, then it's like, what do you do without fear that you're doing something wrong, even when you have no intention of doing anything wrong?
Yeah, so the concern might be that the concern, there could be a concern about we create something that has anybody in one of these positions forevermore freaked out about potentially doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, thank you for saying that better than
no, it's all right. It's all right. You got it. You got us there. And so again, it's the idea of like, how does the process you create help prevent that? So again, like naming that fear is really important. Because who would want that? You all wouldn't want your legacy to be that people are terrified to be in your shoes. So that, having named that fear, my guess is that fear can be mitigated through how you would design. I'll just say personally, like as a member of the legislature, I never was afraid of doing something wrong.
And at the same time, we make it so clear in the process that people would be encouraged to run because now they feel more comfortable knowing that they're not going to get those arrows and scrutiny because it's a much, I don't want to say safer, but it's a much more productive environment.
I mean, so we could flip back to the aspirations question, but we could let the record show that Councilmember Fry has an aspiration that this could actually help encourage people, to want to get more involved because it feels like, okay, there's a process in place that the process is dictating what's back room, what's not back room, things like that. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it.
That's one of the benefits, I think, of us doing this now is every other major city we're comparable to already did it. So we get to figure out from their mistakes if there was overbearing policy that had unintended consequences and they went and they fixed it, we can, through our research, make sure that we don't fall, down that same trap, to make sure our policy is purposeful and it makes sense and it's not just, redundant or unworkable. So I think that's very, very important, but also a very good opportunity that we're doing it at this time, is that we can take the lead that some of the other cities that we're comparable have already done.
Well, and it's time. I mean, as the city has continued to grow and get bigger and more important on a world stage, our government has to grow with that.
Yep.
And not just in size, but in maturity.
Right.
So,
Well, it's also, this might be in the memos from the staff, I can't remember, but it does feel like if you're going from an aspirational policy to calling it an enforceable policy almost puts the emphasis on the negative. I'm not sure how to name it differently, but I think we've done good work here recently of talking about like the value, the benefit of having stuff that is a process that is enforceable. It's not just to like nip bad behavior, it's also to give people confidence, right? So like maybe the way it's talking about it, in some of you know I think out loud, that's how I work sometimes, but the shifting from an aspirational policy to a policy that has a process that gives confidence to the people, to the electeds, right? That shift requires getting clear on the process. Like the process of how things play out is going to be key to whether or not that confidence is there. So, all right, we're uncovering a lot to dig into, but hopefully you're all getting warmed up. The point of this retreat is to get you all warmed up, and I hope you're feeling it. I want to shift to talking about, getting you all talking about public engagement. Before that shift, are there any other concerns you want to name? And again, I hope you've seen how naming the concern helps then the staff and you and your colleagues think about how to mitigate those concerns, right? So if we don't name them, it's hard to mitigate them. But any other concerns you want to name?
Where you're trying to go. So public engagement, and on that, let's say we do a citizen survey and we only get 500 people to respond. And so then the greater public says, well, only 500 people responded to that. So it wasn't enough engagement. Or you only did social media, what about the people who don't have access to internet? They didn't get to engage. So that is one thing, although I want to see that happen. I know we all are going to talk to our constituents, but just having enough engagement to where people feel like enough of the public gave us direction.
Yeah. Any other concerns? If not, let's go there and talk about the process of that engagement. Okay. So here's the way I thought we'd start this conversation. Think of a time when there was high quality public engagement around a policy issue. Think of a time from your own experience in the city, from your experience at a different level of government. Just think of a time when there was really good public engagement around a policy issue. What did that engagement look like? I'm going to give you two questions at once because I've determined you're an advanced group, so I'm going to give you two questions at once. So think of a time when there was high quality public engagement around a policy issue. What did that engagement look like? How did that engagement affect the policy? What did it look like? How did it affect the policy? And you're not deciding right now how to do this public engagement, but we're just trying to get you all thinking about like what has worked. And my third question in a minute will be what type of public engagement feels right for this policy. But for now, it's like what have you seen, what did it look like and how did it help?
I want to go first because I don't want people to steal mine. 2 times and one time as an elected and one time as not, but I was involved in both processes, the development of the master bicycle plan and the master pedestrian plan. And we had significant community involvement before the plan was developed, while the plan was being developed. I remember sitting in this very room with maps and different things, and literally like you couldn't get in the room because there were so many people, which just felt really good. And the product, I think, was better because so many people weighed in. And when you looked at the people who were there, and then there were online opportunities and at different neighborhoods and things and different meetings, but people of every generation. I mean, it was very diverse input, and that was fantastic. fantastic. And then the other example I was going to give is last year, the budget simulator. And one thing that I appreciated about that process, again, it was online, but there were options for people who couldn't do it, but that there were parameters, because sometimes one of my fears of this is that if you just put it out there, how do you get to what you're really asking? You know, because if we just say, oh, what do you think about ethics, City of Wichita community members, we could get so many different responses that we're not able to, synthesize it in a meaningful way. So the budget simulator was a process that was outlined and people got to give input so that it was helpful when we got the data and the input at the end. So those are two examples.
Just on a note, there is science to how do you scope questions at various stages of engagement, and so I hear you saying that like the questions were scoped correctly to get the type of feedback necessary at that time.
Yeah. So, okay. I was just gonna, my experience has been around issues really, Medicaid expansion is one I've got to see a lot, because it's been around for a long time, and the data for data collection is diverse data collection, where I think, and it's an issue that hasn't been solved yet, don't get me wrong, but you wind up with, but it's convinced a majority of the legislature to vote for it, at least the last couple of years. But usually, and what I mean by that, it's not just online, it's not just a survey, it's not just a poll, it's not just, anytime there's a hearing on it, you have both sides, just everyone presenting their cases on both sides. They have to go multiple days for it. When you go online, there's citizen surveys. The professional health organizations have made a stance on it. It's just thorough as far as the different amounts of ways people had input. I'm not saying this has to be that, but I think that to kind of sum up what we can take away is make sure that we can have opportunities for in public meetings. Some people can't go because they have to work, but then opportunities for online interaction like the budget simulator, opportunities for filling out a survey and mailing it in. That's usually the best interaction I've seen is when there's multiple avenues for people to give input, and it's not just we had a town hall about this, and the people who showed up at 2:00 in the afternoon gave us their opinions, so we're moving that way. And that, we want to make sure that, just my experience in politics is usually the ones that you get a whole bunch of data from different groups and different mediums.
Yeah, to that end, and I think you may have had experience with it, because it was during our time, the Park Recreation Open Space Master Plan. We went to all the different users of our park system, from the youth to the elderly and everybody in between. We went to their neighborhoods, to their parks. We held stuff in those facilities. We held meetings with every type of different user groups, from the competition like the Ys, and so it was a variety of things, making sure as many different voices are heard and have the opportunity to get there if they don't have internet or they didn't see the mailer. There's multiple opportunities to weigh in, but so that was a good experience.
I would say Project Wichita. They had 14,000 people respond, and you don't see that often. And I forgot how many meetings, but I think there was at least 60 or so community meetings in different parts of the city to engage different folks and drive it down to those 5 focus areas. So that's one.
Well, and just a real quick note on that one. One of the interesting hallmarks about that one, if I remember correctly, and it could have been true in some of the others, but in Project Wichita, there were independent organizations who took some responsibility for convening some of that. So it was, in addition to like the city going out, it was also people saying, I care enough about this, I'm going to host a conversation.
Yep.
And there's a way for their data to get fed back up into the overall system. So that was a very highly engaging process in multiple ways.
Yep.
What else comes to mind? And go ahead and start. You're welcome to start shifting to the next part of the question of what feels right for this. I know every single piece of policy you all pass, you can't do what Project Wichita did.
Right.
So you don't need to figure it out right now, but a sense of right now of like what might feel right. And the way I imagine this would work is Bob and the team they'll think through all these notes, they'll think about what's emerging, they'll think about, is there a guiding principle or two that they heard to lift up for get you all to react to? And I can imagine they'll also be thinking about, based on this conversation about process, what might be kind of an approach to the engagement, right? So not that you need to decide it right now or that they're going to decide it for you, but this is going to spark what they might cook up. So what do you think?
Or dabs and breakfast for sure, going out and talking to folks there.
I think that also good public policy like this, like it's broken down in different sections. The aspirational stuff is good, and we should take feedback on that. When we get into what, if you trigger to an ethics board, what does that look like? Well, there's the internal models and the external models. If we go external, which means members of our community sit on an ethics board, so if there's a problem, they review it first. I would be really interested in a public discussion on who should be on that. Should it be the chair of the ministerial league or their designee with the chair of, the Chamber of Commerce or their designee? Who does the community see organizationally as, should it be the Hugo Wall Schools chair or their designee? Like, who does the community see as these are the pillars of model or the model of groups in our community, and we want those people at the table as an ethics board to try to keep our electeds in line and make those decisions if something goes that far. That would be a really interesting conversation, because I think if we just did that type of conversation, well, we default on who we trust. But when you go more wide with that, then you could have a really interesting discussion and I think results of, and like I said, this is if we decide to go the external board model instead of having the board be consist of employees. It would be interesting.
Don't we have to let the community kind of weigh in first on what they see that direction should go first? In terms of who does that review and if it's necessary and who should be leading that, whether it's driven from us or if it's, I think we're a little ahead of the game there, aren't we?
Well, I think it has to do with the scoping of the questions and I think at different points, my experience is at different points of engagement, you need questions that are more broad and questions that are more narrow. And you need both. You need both, right?
And that was a narrow response, yeah. So, and I apologize. If you read Flingy's article on ethics reform that he had in the paper, Professor Flingy, there's 3 parts to strong ethics reform. There's the code of conduct, and then there's someone violated the code of conduct or are suspected of that, and then you need the board that can determine that, the judges. And that's, the Kansas Ethics has their board. If we went down that, we'd have our board, and then you have somewhat of an acceptance or appeal process where, what's the trigger then where you don't accept that so that the elected official would then trigger into some policy has, a law firm, or pretty much it's how you implement the teeth, like how you decide who gets what fines. So yeah, you're right. In this conversation, if we're kind of just starting it here today, we're way ahead of it. But I've been researching this for a little while, so I know that we have at least these 3 pillars. And that second part, if we're talking about the public, I'd be really interested to see what groups, if we ask that question, we got to that point, decided to go down that road, does the public find like above par?
So maybe a question to play with for a minute is, how would you initially frame this conversation with the public? Right, so because knowing that you might be able to have more than one bite of the apple, right? And so how would you? Picture yourself at a breakfast meeting, or picture yourself at a town hall, or picture an initial survey, right? I'm just a citizen. I'm hearing about this for the first time. Jeff is talking about this for the very first time. How is Jeff framing this? How are you framing this initially, right? Because my sense is you want feedback on the specific, right? As you have specifics, you need feedback on the specifics. And something like, how do you help people get to the point where they're ready to talk about, or give you good feedback on the specifics? Sorry that I'm babbling so much.
No, and I just want to add a caveat to that, that Bob and I talked about too, is that how do you talk to the community, ask their input, but not raise an alarm that shouldn't. And I always joke, I have the most cynical parents on the face of the earth. And for that, sometimes I'm grateful because it gives me a scope and a lens that I don't have. But let's say that there was a breakfast and my mom and dad went and they said, today we're going to talk about the elected officials and an ethics policy. My mom would say, what have they done? Right? I mean, there must be a problem or you wouldn't be talking about it. And so I think that needs to be taken into consideration too when we do frame it up to the community, that this is an opportunity for us to improve, not necessarily correct.
I think
Thank you.
what I would do if we were in a breakfast setting, and it's something that I already do, and I think it works quite well because it makes people feel like they're in control of the conversation, is just ask people the question, what is your perspective? Find out what the perspective of the public is. Don't assume you know what the perspective of the public is. And you let the public start to define what the issues are that you need to work on. Because the public already has perception of what a politician is, good or bad. You bring up politics or a politician, and I used to love telling lawyer jokes, loved it.
Who doesn't?
I hate those and political jokes now, politician jokes, right? Because I'm always
Jennifer, you're not
brunt
insulted
of-
by that.
Oh no, we're in the same boat. So kind of, but I really think that if you want to, I don't want to say do the soft sell, but if you really want to do it in a way that makes your mother, grandmother, or family go, well, what did you do wrong? You just ask the public, almost, what do you think we're doing wrong? Or what do you think the issues are when it comes to ethics in politics at City Hall, and just let the public start defining what those things are that you need to start working on.
Yeah, that's smart. Also, just I want to expand the idea of public input, where I think it's really good to start talking about, okay, what are the fears that the public has, and then we can address those in the aspirational stuff. But public, we also have people who are experts on this. So once you kind of get to the drafting, where, Carol Williams, she's retired now. I bet she'd love to look at this and give feedback. Was the standard for when she ran to governmental ethics. I know we have professors over at the Hugo Wall School who probably are very versed in ethics, and that gives us a level of, or this type of ethics reform, not just ethics as a philosophy. And that also gives us, I think, some credibility, moving forward, that we did like all of our due diligence, where not only did we go through, make sure that, the people at our breakfasts, or your guys' breakfasts, because I don't have one, sadly, that their concerns were met, but also that, we got it proofread or pre-graded by the people who have built a career doing this type of stuff. And I'll just put out there, the guy who, and I forget his name and I shouldn't, who runs Kansas Ethics now. I was on the elections committee, so I got to know him. After I was elected mayor, he said, hey, if you want me to take a look at your proposals or anything, if you guys go that route, I'd be happy to look it over. And I bet there are lots of people who, like I said, make a career out of this. Legally, this is their world, who would love to review and give input, who aren't associated with any one of us here.
So I'm hearing a couple things, just to try to name them. One of them is a blend of public input and, for lack of a better term, we might call it subject matter expert input. All of one probably isn't a good idea, right? If you just get subject matter expert input or just get public input, because there is some expertise, there is a body of knowledge about how these things can work. So I'm hearing a blend of that. Also hearing that much like once this is in place, whatever this is, we've talked a lot about how let the process do work. Let the process provide confidence for the public. Similar to that, what I'm hearing in some of this exchange is the process of creating the policy needs to be thoughtful too. And how does that process create confidence? How does that process create has it start with them rather than starting where we're at, let's start with them. But those words aren't coming to me very well. But is that what you all are hearing in some of this? That doesn't seem hard to do. It seems that, and this could be also something for you all to talk about, right? Think about knowing that staff's gonna go do some work and come back and show you something. And I think the framing of how you frame this feels really, really important. It can be framed in a way that, there's a 5-alarm fire going on.
Yeah.
It can be framed in the way of, we want to be the model, right? We want to be the model for confidence and trust and for ethics. I mean, those are two very different framings. You can easily imagine how it could be framed either way, right? And now that you're all independent people, you can do this however you want to, but you might try to discover, can you find some consistency on how you're going to frame it as you do this work?
Well, and I also think, because your question is what feels right for this, I don't want us to lose sight of the scoping the questions.
Yeah.
Because if we just turn all 7 of us loose and say, go find out what you can find out, I'm not sure that wouldn't feel right to me, but having some process to the process, right? A process for how we gather information. And I learned when you and I worked on the strategic plan for WSU, we had those town halls we did, we scoped the questions. Some were very detailed, some were more aspirational, and it got us down to what we needed to know to be able to develop that strategic plan.
That was a really good strategic plan too, wasn't
It
it?
was.
That was some good work.
It was good
It
work.
was like a long time ago.
It actually was really.
So I think because you brought up a breakfast earlier, so for me, it would be asking the community or leading with, we're looking at improving our ethics policy. Everyone's aware of the campaign last year, so I don't think it would be alarmist to say that. Right. And then to ask, what is your perception right now of city government and the city council in regard to ethics? And then as they outline their perception, kind of to what you do at KLC, then how do we get to a place that you want to be? So what do you want to be as far as that goes? And then what are some policies that you would suggest to help us get to that? And I think that will begin to also align with subject matter experts as well, once you get them thinking about how they would feel comfortable with council policy.
And I think it's important too to understand that when we're asking the question of those people, they're not inside our bubble. We are
That's what I was just gonna say.
We are in our own bubble. We're in a political bubble, we're in a city hall bubble, and so we've got to be very cognizant that we're going to hear answers that we don't want to hear. Maybe ones that aren't completely accurate, but it's still the perception, no matter where that came from.
And Brandon, when you were saying that, I was thinking, ooh, I think that's such a good idea, but there might need to be some, I'm not saying, multiple choice or Likert scale or whatever it may be, just because, my neighbor's not sitting around thinking about ethics for the city council today, right? They're thinking about everything else in their world. So while we're trying to gain information, I think we have to do some education at the same time. And again, I said this before, but I want to say it again. It's because we want to make it better, not because we're trying to correct something, right? A problem doesn't exist, but we want to make sure one doesn't, so.
I would encourage you all to, people like Ed Flingy, some of these other subject matter experts have a lot of expertise on even how to frame these questions and like how to ask things of the public, because ultimately it's not that you want the public to feel engaged, you want them to be engaged. There's a difference, right? And you want that engagement to produce data that then informs the policy so that you come closer to achieving those aspirations than you would otherwise, and you do a better job of mitigating those concerns than you would otherwise. And so some of those folks, there might be a standard Likert scale type question that somebody like Ed Flingy would know, lead with this question, and then you can even compare to other cities, whatever. But there are smart folks out there who can, I'm sure, be helpful.
If you look at some of the engagements you listed as successes, the commonalities is work on the front end, right? Mm-hmm. And then bringing the work back and checking in and modifying as a result of that. Yeah. And then releasing a final plan and getting buy-offs. That's not a bad way to approach it. One of the things, Ed, you said that I really like is a little bit of an alternative to what you outlined, Brandon, just for you to think about is, that if the idea is to be the model, right, to be the best in class, whatever you want to call that, if that's how you engage the public, you don't get caught up in a whole bunch of "you're all crooks at City Hall" type of
Right.
thing that detracts from the conversation. It's if we're doing this right and we're setting the standard for the nation in terms of ethical behavior, what does that look like? What do you expect from City Hall? And that gets everybody thinking about the best. Because I've always argued that when people get mad and talk about ethics, it's because they have very high expectations and hold us to a high standard. And when they think we do something that doesn't line up with that expectation, that's when they call us out, right? So I think if you asked them, what do you expect? What is that model? What do you expect of officials? I think they'll give you a really good list. We've had conversations about this probably throughout my career, and it's interesting when you hear people articulate it that way.
But, on the statewide level, the Medicaid work was similar to that, going out, getting feedback, adjusting, going out, getting feedback, adjusting, that kind of process was, I think, a hallmark of those groups who did that work. Narrowing and narrowing and narrowing, what they were talking about as they engaged, as time went on, so.
And it ended with a way different product than what it would have if we had engaged. And nothing passed, don't get me wrong, but the bill that was last, that could have passed if COVID didn't close everything, was the one that was created by the governor, who's a Democrat.
Yeah.
And over in the Senate, Denning, who is the leader in the Republican caucus. It was truly bipartisan and a product of all of that discussion coming in that created, this model that, who knows if it'll get a vote again, but the product at the very least, the policy was a product of that input and that work.
I just want to underline one other thing that Bob said too that feels like a really important distinction. My experience when you're doing messy stuff, and any public policy is messy, right? When you're trying to engage a lot of people in something, like you want to make sure that the process of creating the policy doesn't end up trying to do the work that the policy is supposed to do, right? So like the process of creating the ethics reform is not designed, shouldn't be, in my opinion, be designed to root out unethical behavior in City Hall. The policy should be designed to root out unethical behavior in City Hall if there is any. But the process, and I think as you engage people who don't think about this all the time, you need to be thoughtful of how to structure the engagement. So you can let them talk about both, but you want to make sure that this gets you what you need to create this policy. Then that policy is going to do that work. Does that make sense? I mean, I just think that feels real important. We just have 6 minutes left, and I keep talking about how staff has taken all these great notes, and they'll be back with more, and I'm sure they will. And I don't know exactly your all's process for doing things like that, but I've taken a bunch of notes. There's notes there, there's notes here, and I'd be happy to engage with the staff just to put our heads together on what did we hear, and be happy to be involved with that.
You signed up for life.
Well, paybacks, everybody.
And I do want to say, I appreciate you so much. When I called Ed and asked him to do this, I was really turning up the heat on him, and I'm extremely grateful that you agreed, not only just for making yourself vulnerable, because this is kind of an uncomfortable topic, but also for your time. I know that you spent time preparing, you discussed this all with us. We had to reschedule with you one time, but I asked a big favor, and I'm forever grateful for it, so thank you.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, and it's an honor to be helpful. It really is. It's you all, especially with everything happening in the year 2020.
What? There's something going on?
You all have a lot going on, and those of us who aren't in your roles, if there are ways we can be helpful, we need to do that. I would love for us to close with a real quick, what went well about this conversation, what could have made the conversation better. And I just think it's useful to, the language we would use at KLC, get up on the balcony, look down on the conversation, and just do a little reflection on it. And by the way, you won't hurt my feelings if you're like, I wish it would have been facilitated differently. You won't hurt my feelings. Don't worry. Once you've been an elected official, you have really thick skin, right? So, but what went well about the conversation And we don't have to overthink this or overtalk it, but what went well and what might you all consider doing differently in future conversations?
I appreciate not having a presentation and a PowerPoint and allowing us to talk through these open-ended questions. I think it helps bring up different ideas and not such a react to something you're presenting on a screen. So we could build off conversations and take an idea and say, yeah, that's something I hadn't thought of, but here's another side to it. So that helped encourage dialogue.
Well,
One thing that I think you did went well, but you helped facilitate to make sure it happened well, is that there are 7 different people here who are completely different. No one's opinion is more important. Nobody has a better idea than anyone else. We all come with an equal vote, and I really feel like the process felt good for that everybody's opinion matters as much as anyone else's. Nobody has any more, I don't know what the word is, but everybody isn't equal, and it really felt that way to me today. So thank you for making sure that happened.
Oh, I only recorded James's comments.
They were that good, were they?
what else?
Already posted on Facebook.
But again, and not just about me, about like how we did. Well, we got 120, 150 seconds left. What went well? What could have gone better?
I was really nervous that this was going to be more defensive, that coming in and having this conversation, and I feel that the format, and it might be because of you and your experience with this, it was very constructive. It was very much, very much focused on, we're all in agreement. Let's have the best plan we can. Let's involve the public. Like, it was very constructive, and my fear coming in was that it might be more contentious, and I'm glad it wasn't.
The 30,000 foot, 40,000 foot level start really, I think, helped with dialogue, with defining things, with that sort of thing. I'm looking forward to steering this plane into a nice, smooth landing and getting
It's a
some
private
stuff
plane.
done.
And do a nice.
I agree. You know I like details, so, but it was good. It's good to be up here. And today, it was just good to have that dialogue. And I like when Bob interjects. He doesn't always do that as city manager and lets us talk, but it was good having Bob's input, and especially after what James said about when Bob got here and how he really changed the culture. So having Bob's input was good to me today.
We're raving fans, Bob.
Whether it was deserved or not before Bob is not the debate, but there really was a shift, so kudos, Bob.
Anything that could have made the discussion better? And again, just like focusing on the concerns can be useful, focusing on what could have made something better can be helpful in thinking about future engagements. So anything come on, Jeff?
Got my Six Sigma black belt hat on. Thought we were gonna have more of a measurable discussion. I thought maybe we had a little bit of scope creep, or maybe
Okay.
I didn't understand what we'd be discussing. I thought we'd kind of get a little more detailed, other than, what's ethical, what's not. I mean, some of this seemed like a college room discussion where I don't know that hurt feelings is unethical, or, because we all have different styles, but behaviors that can lead to ethics. I guess I was looking for a little more meat and substance and
Yeah, that works.
decision-making and kind of narrowing out the X's. So.
Yep, okay, got it. Others?
This is not going to be the only one of these, correct? We're going to continue on and
Yeah,
As we
I
start
would
refining
think you all
things.
need to think that through and, what makes the most sense, but, yeah.
Well, the next step, it seems, and I could be wrong, that it start talking to our constituents about the aspirational list and trying to get that put together, probably do some homework, figure out what other places are doing, and getting into what I think Jeff wants, what's the meat, and that's probably how staff will. That's usually what they do, right? Where you guys come in and we do the 1,000-foot view, and then we start getting into details, and then we get into items, so.
We'll have to compare, we'll talk about the
Okay.
process, but first thing we'll do is get your notes put together, right? And get that out to you, make sure that reflects what you did today. And then probably provide some guidance or some recommendations on process based on what we're hearing, right? And then give that, you can shoot at that. And then once we get some agreement there, then we'll go. If you want an engagement process to begin with, we'll do best practice research in the meantime, but that still will be steered somewhat by what you get as public input before we start to lock in on tangible documents.
And just a request, because I know that some of the grad students who, or newly graduated students who help us with policy are fresh out of research methods. Are there any questions that might be recommended that we ask probing questions that could help us get really good feedback beyond just like, what do you think about politicians? You know, instead like those type of, because just like the moderator said, you know, professors aren't just good at content, but also like asking questions, getting that content. Like I know there's an art to asking questions. Maybe we could even get together, what are some of the best questions to kind of spearhead getting the most constructive feedback?
Yeah, I think it's really wise, and I would, sometimes you gotta go slow to go fast. Well, I think personally, as a former elected, thinking about stuff like this, talking to people is fine, but I think, you know, should wait just a little bit for a formal process, see what emerges, see what some subject matter experts might have to say about a process. You know, and there are people, and there are facilitators with real knowledge on this topic. Like I have the knowledge you have on ethics, right? But there are people that could provide real meat and potatoes of, you know, ethics issues that also could help you shape questions, engage the public around those. But yeah, and I'm conscious because you got a birthday party to go to, and it's 5:02, so I'm going to stop talking. But I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you. Thanks for letting me engage in this way, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you.
And
Thanks,
best of
Ed.
luck with this, and happy to be helpful going forward with it.
Thank
you, sir.
All right, we're adjourned. Oh.
Will that be an email, or will we do that in a workshop, reporting back?
Started already.
Probably start, maybe doing the weeklies, I mean, give it